I slide the lease agreement into the envelope, while my daughter rearranges furniture in what used to be my bedroom. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as I prepared coffee for two. Sarah would arrive soon with her usual enthusiasm and her usual assumptions. At 62, I had grown accustomed to her visits, though they had become more frequent since her divorce 6 months ago. She claimed she needed emotional support, but I suspected she needed something more tangible. The house felt different lately. Rooms that once echoed with the laughter of grandchildren now held a peculiar tension. Sarah had been making comments about the space, about how much room I didn't really need. She spoke of practicality with the fervor of someone who had already made decisions in private. I heard her car door slam in the driveway. Through the window, I watched her stride toward the front door with that determined walk she had inherited from her mother. She carried a small overnight bag and wore the expression of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. The coffee was still brewing when she entered without knocking. She had stopped asking permission for small things months ago. Now she moved through my home as if testing boundaries, measuring spaces with her eyes. She hugged me briefly and commented on how tired I looked. The observation felt like an assessment rather than concern. I offered her coffee, and she accepted while scanning the living room with that familiar appraising glance. We sat at the kitchen table where I had shared thousands of meals with her mother. Sarah spoke about her job stress and her cramped apartment. She mentioned how much she missed having a real home, a place with character and memories. Her words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. The conversation drifted to my daily routine. She asked about my sleep, my eating habits, whether I felt safe living alone in such a large house. Each question felt like a small probe, testing for weakness or vulnerability. I listened and responded with the patience that comes from decades of parenting. But something had shifted in the dynamic between us. She was no longer seeking advice or comfort. She was conducting an evaluation. The morning stretched into afternoon. Sarah moved freely through the house, commenting on furniture placement and room usage. She lingered in doorways, mentally rearranging spaces that weren't hers to change. Her familiarity with my home had transformed into something that felt like ownership. As evening approached, she unpacked her overnight bag in the guest room, but her eyes kept wandering toward my bedroom, toward the space with the best natural light and the private bathroom. She spoke of temporary arrangements with the confidence of someone who had already decided they would become permanent. I prepared dinner while she continued her subtle inventory of my life. Every observation she made felt like a small theft, as if she were cataloging assets rather than visiting her father. The house that had sheltered us both for decades had become something to be divided. That night, I lay in my bed listening to the sounds of someone else's presence in my home. Sarah moved through the hallway with a familiarity that suggested she had already begun to see this place as partly hers. The darkness felt heavier than usual, weighted with unspoken intentions. The walls of my bedroom seemed to whisper with the echoes of plans being made in other rooms. I could hear Sarah settling into the guest room, but her presence felt temporary, transitional, as if she were merely camping while waiting for permanent accommodations to become available. Outside, the wind moved through the old oak trees that had watched over this house for decades. Their rustling sounded like conversations I couldn't quite understand, secrets being shared in a language of leaves and branches. Sleep came fitfully that night. I dreamed of rooms changing their configurations while I slept, walls moving to accommodate new residents who had never asked permission to stay. The house in my dreams felt like a living thing, reshaping itself according to the will of its most determined occupant. Sarah's visits became more frequent over the following weeks. She arrived with increasing amounts of personal belongings, claiming temporary storage needs while her life stabilized. Each item she brought felt like a small colonization of my space. She began rearranging common areas without asking. A throw pillow appeared on my couch. Her coffee mug claimed permanent residence beside the sink. Small changes that individually seemed harmless, but collectively created a new geography of ownership. The conversations grew more pointed. She expressed concern about my isolation, my age, the burden of maintaining such a large house alone. Her words carried the weight of decisions made in my absence, plans that had been forming in discussions I wasn't invited to join. I noticed she had been taking photographs of rooms. When I asked about it, she claimed she was documenting family memories, but her focus seemed more architectural than sentimental, capturing angles and dimensions rather than moments of meaning. Her brother Mark began appearing for family dinners with unusual frequency. They spoke in half sentences and shared glances that suggested prior conversations. The atmosphere during these meals felt like a board meeting disguised as family time. The discussions about my future became less subtle. They spoke of senior communities with enthusiasm, describing amenities and social opportunities. Their research was thorough, their presentations polished. They had clearly been planning this transition without consulting the person most affected by it. I listened to their concerns with the composure of someone who had learned to recognize manipulation dressed as caring. They painted pictures of my decline that didn't match my experience of my own vitality. Their version of my life required rescue from circumstances I didn't recognize. Sarah's stays extended from overnight visits to 3-day weekends. She established routines in my home that excluded me from my own spaces. The guest bathroom became exclusively hers. The second remote control disappeared into her temporary domain. One evening, I overheard her on the phone discussing room measurements and furniture arrangements. She spoke with the casual authority of someone who had already claimed ownership. Her tone suggested the current occupant was merely a temporary obstacle to be managed. The house began to feel like I was the guest. Sarah's presence expanded to fill spaces, while mine contracted to accommodate her growing territory. She made decisions about household supplies and meal planning as if I had abdicated responsibility for my own life. Her confidence grew with each successful encroachment. She redirected my mail to a folder she managed. She answered my phone calls with information about my availability. Small acts of caretaking that felt more like small acts of conquest. I maintained my routines while observing hers. She had created a parallel life within my home, complete with her own schedule, her own priorities, her own sense of entitlement to space I had never offered to share. The seasons were changing outside, and the house felt different in the shifting light. Windows that had always framed familiar views now seemed to reveal territories under negotiation. The autumn colors reminded me of boundaries being redrawn without my consent. In the evenings, when Sarah thought I was watching television, I often stood at my bedroom window looking out at the neighborhood I had called home for 30 years. The other houses looked solid and permanent, their owners secure in their possession of spaces that couldn't be claimed by visiting relatives. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had worked decades to pay for this house, had maintained it through countless seasons of wear and weather, had filled it with memories and meaning. Now my own daughter was systematically erasing my presence as if I were already gone. The revelation came through a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Sarah spoke to Mark from the kitchen while I retrieved something from my bedroom. Her voice carried the casual certainty of someone discussing accomplished facts rather than future possibilities. She described my bedroom as if it were already hers, the natural light, the private bathroom, the space that would perfectly accommodate her needs. She mentioned having measured the room for her furniture, having identified which of my belongings would need to be relocated. Mark's responses suggested they had been coordinating this transition for weeks. He spoke of storage solutions for my displaced possessions and timeline considerations for the room exchange. Their planning was methodical, detailed, and conducted entirely without my knowledge or consent. The conversation shifted to my resistance, which they discussed like a minor technical problem to be solved. Sarah described strategies for making the change seem like my idea, ways to frame the room swap as beneficial to my comfort and safety. Her manipulation had been calculated and comprehensive. They spoke about my attachment to space, with the dismissive tone reserved for irrational behavior. My preference for my own bedroom was treated as an obstacle to overcome rather than a boundary to respect. They had reduced my autonomy to an inconvenience. I stood frozen in the hallway, processing the extent of their presumption. They had been living in my future, making decisions about my life, and treating my home as if I were already gone. The betrayal felt both intimate and institutional, personal and procedural. The conversation continued with practical details. Sarah had already identified which of her furniture would replace mine. She had researched local storage facilities for my displaced belongings. Her takeover had been planned with the thoroughness of a military operation. Mark mentioned their mother's estate, suggesting that Sarah's inheritance gave her certain rights to family property. They had constructed a financial justification for territorial conquest, transforming affection into asset management. Their discussion moved to timelines. Sarah wanted to complete the room exchange before I could organize resistance. Speed would prevent me from seeking outside perspectives or alternative arrangements. They planned to present me with accomplished facts rather than negotiable proposals. I retreated to my bedroom, the space they had already claimed in conversation. The room felt different now, contaminated by their presumption. Every piece of furniture, every personal belonging, had been evaluated and dismissed by people who had never been given permission to make such assessments. The walls that had contained decades of my privacy now felt transparent. Sarah and Mark had been mentally rearranging my life, displacing my presence to make room for their vision of more efficient space utilization. That night, I lay in the bed they intended to relocate, in the room they had already given away. The darkness carried new weight, thick with the knowledge that my own family had been planning to erase my place in my own home. Their betrayal wasn't dramatic or confrontational. It was administrative, methodical, and conducted with the casual efficiency of people who had convinced themselves they were acting in my best interests while serving their own. The house around me felt different now, as if the walls had been listening to their conversations and had begun to question my right to occupy the spaces I had created and maintained. Even the familiar sounds of settling wood and adjusting foundation seemed to whisper of impending displacement. I thought about my wife, gone now for 5 years, and how she would have responded to this situation. She had always been protective of our home, our space, our right to age in place with dignity. Her absence felt particularly sharp in moments like this, when family loyalty was being tested by family greed. The morning light, when it finally came, felt different too. It illuminated rooms that I now knew were being evaluated and redistributed by people who had never contributed to their creation or maintenance. My sanctuary had become their real estate opportunity. The days following my accidental discovery moved with strange slowness. I maintained normal interactions with Sarah while processing the magnitude of her presumption. Every casual comment about room usage or furniture placement now carried the weight of her hidden agenda. She continued her documentation project, photographing my bedroom from multiple angles. When I asked about her interest in the space, she claimed she was preserving memories of family gatherings. Her lie came easily, practiced and smooth. I began to notice details I had previously overlooked. She had been testing furniture placement, moving small items to see how the space would accommodate her belongings. My nightstand had been repositioned twice, each adjustment bringing it closer to her vision of the room's future configuration. The guest bathroom had been fully colonized. Her toiletries occupied every available surface, arranged with the permanence of someone who had no intention of leaving. My house had become her residence, with me as the temporary occupant of my own home. Sarah's conversations with Mark continued, though they now occurred with more discretion. I heard fragments through closed doors, references to timelines and storage solutions. They had moved from planning phase to implementation, treating my displacement as a logistical challenge rather than a moral question. The emotional impact settled slowly, like sediment in still water. The betrayal wasn't sharp and sudden, but dense and suffocating. My own child had been systematically erasing my presence in the space I had created and maintained for decades. I found myself studying my bedroom with new eyes, seeing it as Sarah saw it, an underutilized resource in the wrong hands. The room that had been my sanctuary was now merely square footage to be optimized. My attachment to the space had been reduced to an irrational obstacle. Sleep became difficult. I lay in the bed they intended to relocate, staring at ceilings they had already claimed. The room felt haunted by their presumption, contaminated by plans made in my absence. Every shadow seemed to whisper of displacement and dispossession. During the day I maintained normal routines while my mind worked through possibilities. Sarah's betrayal required a response, but the response needed to match the methodical nature of her offense. Sudden confrontation would only accelerate her timeline and eliminate my strategic advantages. I began my own documentation project, photographing the current state of my home, recording the progression of Sarah's territorial expansion. Evidence gathering felt like preparation for a trial where I would need to prove ownership of my own life. The isolation was profound. Sarah had positioned herself as my primary family contact, controlling information flow between me and Mark, managing my social connections through her growing authority over my daily routine. She had created dependency while claiming to provide support. My anger remained quiet and controlled, like a fire banked for later use. The betrayal deserved a response equal to its calculated nature. Sarah had planned my displacement with careful attention to detail. Her consequences would require similar precision. The house felt like a chessboard now, with pieces being moved according to strategies I was only beginning to understand. Sarah had been playing a long game while I had assumed we were simply sharing family time. Her patience had been tactical, her kindness calculated. I walked through rooms that had witnessed decades of family gatherings, holiday celebrations, quiet moments of contentment. Now they felt like stages being prepared for a different play, with different actors, serving different purposes. The continuity of my life was being edited by people who had never asked for permission to make revisions. The garden outside my bedroom window was preparing for winter, plants dying back to make room for spring growth. The metaphor felt too obvious, too painful. But unlike the garden, my dormancy wasn't voluntary or natural. It was being imposed by people who had confused love with management. Sarah's confidence grew as her occupation expanded. She began making decisions about household operations without consultation, ordering groceries that reflected her preferences, scheduling service appointments during times that suited her routine rather than mine. The phone calls between her and Mark became more frequent and more detailed. They discussed my behavioral patterns, like researchers studying a subject, identifying the optimal moment for implementing their final phase. Their analysis was thorough and dehumanizing. She started bringing potential furniture pieces to test in my bedroom. A new lamp appeared on my nightstand, positioned to provide better reading light for her evening routine. When I asked about it, she claimed it was a gift to improve my quality of life. Mark visited more often, ostensibly for family dinners, but actually to assess progress on their shared project. He examined my bedroom with the calculating gaze of someone measuring space for different purposes. Their coordination was seamless and professional. Sarah began expressing concern about my sleep quality, suggesting that a room change might provide better rest. She had researched the health benefits of different bedroom orientations, presenting her territorial ambition as medical advice. Her manipulation had evolved to include scientific justification. The guest room, she argued, received better morning light and offered a quieter environment. Her analysis ignored my decades of comfortable sleep in my current bedroom, treating my preferences as obstacles to optimal health outcomes. She had reframed theft as therapeutic intervention. Her belongings continued to multiply throughout my house. Clothes appeared in my closets, claiming space with the gradual persistence of occupying forces. Each item represented another degree of territorial conquest, another assumption of permanent residence. The conversation about senior communities became more aggressive. Sarah presented brochures with increasing frequency, highlighting amenities that would justify abandoning the home I had spent decades creating. Her sales pitch was polished and relentless. Mark contributed financial analysis, demonstrating how selling the house would fund superior care arrangements. They had calculated the monetary value of displacing me from my own life, reducing my autonomy to a mathematical equation. Their logic was impeccable and completely divorced from human considerations. I listened to their presentations with the patience of someone who had already decided on a different outcome. Their thorough planning would serve my purposes better than theirs. Every detail they had researched would become evidence of their presumption and manipulation. Sarah's timeline was accelerating. She spoke of room exchanges with increasing urgency, suggesting that delays would only make the transition more difficult. Her concern for my emotional comfort was transparently tactical, designed to minimize resistance rather than ensure genuine well-being. The house felt like contested territory, with boundaries shifting daily in Sarah's favor. My space contracted while hers expanded, each adjustment bringing her closer to complete occupation. She moved through my home like someone who had already inherited it, but her success had made her careless. The thoroughness of her planning would provide the perfect foundation for consequences she had never considered. Every presumption she had made would become the basis for lessons she had never expected to learn. The turning point was approaching, though Sarah couldn't see it through the haze of her own certainty. She had planned everything except the possibility that her victim might refuse to remain passive. Her strategy assumed compliance that was about to be dramatically withdrawn. The winter light was different now, shorter and more focused. It seemed to illuminate the essential elements of my situation while leaving distractions in shadow. Clarity was emerging from the confusion Sarah had created, revealing possibilities she had never anticipated. My preparations continued quietly, methodically, with the same attention to detail that Sarah had invested in her takeover plans. But my strategy was defensive where hers was offensive, legal where hers was emotional, permanent where hers assumed temporary resistance. The preparation phase required patience and precision. While Sarah continued her gradual occupation of my home, I began researching tenant rights, lease requirements, and rental market conditions. Her presumption of free residence would soon encounter legal reality. I consulted with a real estate attorney, presenting the situation as a hypothetical case involving family members who had assumed residence without formal agreements. The legal framework for addressing such situations was clear and comprehensive. Documentation would be essential for establishing proper landlord-tenant relationships. Sarah's confidence had reached the point where she openly discussed permanent arrangements. She spoke of my bedroom as if the transfer had already occurred, describing her plans for redecorating and furniture placement. Her casual certainty provided perfect evidence of her intentions. I began documenting her residence pattern, recording dates of continuous occupancy, utility usage, and territorial expansion. The legal definition of tenancy was being established through her own behavior, creating obligations she had never considered accepting. The research revealed interesting possibilities. As an established resident, Sarah would be subject to formal eviction procedures if she refused to accept reasonable tenancy terms. Her assumption of free residence would become legally complex and financially disadvantageous. Mark's visits provided additional evidence of coordinated family pressure designed to displace me from my own property. His participation in planning my removal could be documented and addressed through appropriate legal channels. Their conspiracy was thorough and thoroughly documented. I contacted a property management company inquiring about market rates for bedroom rental in houses similar to mine. The figures were substantial, reflecting the desirability of private bathroom access and natural light exposure. Sarah's free residence represented significant monthly value. The lease preparation required careful attention to standard terms and local regulations. Security deposits, utility responsibilities, noise restrictions, and guest policies would all be clearly defined. Sarah's casual occupation would become a formal business relationship with explicit expectations and consequences. I researched comparable rental properties in the area, gathering evidence to support reasonable market pricing for the bedroom she had claimed. Her financial obligations would reflect the true cost of the space she had been using without compensation or permission. The documentation process was methodical and satisfying. Every photograph, every recorded conversation fragment, every witness to her presumptuous behavior would support the transformation of her territorial conquest into a legally binding rental arrangement. Sarah's timeline was approaching its climax. She had begun moving furniture pieces into position for her final takeover. Her confidence was absolute, her planning complete, her assumptions about my passivity total. The trap was ready for activation. The irony was perfect. Sarah's thorough occupation of my bedroom would become the legal basis for her formal tenancy obligation. Her presumption of free residence would transform into expensive monthly rent payments. her territorial conquest would become financial liability. Every detail she had planned would serve my purposes instead of hers. The room she had claimed would become her legal responsibility, complete with market-rate pricing and standard tenant obligations. Her betrayal would generate income instead of displacement. The legal precedents were clear and favorable. Established residents created tenant rights that came with tenant responsibilities. Sarah's months of occupation had generated legal standing that would work against her interests rather than for them. The attorney's advice was encouraging and specific. The documentation I had gathered would easily support tenancy establishment, making Sarah's position legally complex and financially disadvantageous. Her presumption had created vulnerability she had never anticipated. My strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Sarah's own actions would become the foundation for consequences that matched the methodical nature of her betrayal. Her careful planning would serve justice rather than conquest, education rather than displacement. Sarah's final phase began on a Tuesday morning in March. She announced that the room exchange would happen that weekend, presenting the decision as inevitable and beneficial. Her tone carried the authority of someone who had mistaken manipulation for consensus. She had arranged for Mark to help with furniture moving, treating my displacement as a logistical exercise rather than a violation of my autonomy. Their coordination was seamless, their presumption absolute, their blindness to consequences complete. The guest room had been prepared for my occupancy without my input or consent. Sarah had selected furnishings that reflected her vision of appropriate accommodations for an elderly father. Her choices were practical, institutional, and designed to minimize my territorial claims. She spoke of the transition as temporary, suggesting that further arrangements would depend on my adjustment to the new configuration. The implication was clear. My bedroom was permanently lost, my future residence subject to her ongoing evaluation and approval. Mark arrived early Saturday morning with a moving truck, as if my displacement required professional logistics. Their efficiency was impressive, their certainty complete, their assumption of my compliance total. They had planned everything except my response. Sarah directed the operation from what she now called her new bedroom. She had already begun personalizing the space, hanging pictures and arranging possessions with the confidence of rightful ownership. My decades of residence had been erased in a single morning. The movers worked quickly, relocating my belongings to the guest room, with the casual efficiency of people handling routine business transactions. My furniture became cargo. My possessions became inventory. My life became a logistical challenge to be solved. By afternoon, the transformation was complete. Sarah had established residence in my former bedroom with the thoroughness of someone who had been planning this occupation for months. Her belongings filled every space. Her routine claimed every convenience. Her presence dominated every corner. She thanked me for my cooperation with the patronizing gratitude reserved for children who had behaved well during difficult procedures. Her appreciation was genuine, reflecting her belief that she had successfully managed a complex family transition. The guest room felt like temporary housing, furnished with pieces selected for utility rather than comfort. Sarah had created accommodation that would encourage further compliance with her vision of appropriate living arrangements for someone of my age and declining independence. That evening, she cooked dinner in my kitchen, served at my table, while discussing her satisfaction with the new room arrangement. Her contentment was complete, her victory total, her blindness to consequences absolute. I listened and smiled and expressed appreciation for her concern for my welfare. My response matched her expectations perfectly, confirming her assessment of my character and my likely future compliance with additional adjustments she might propose. But the trap had been activated the moment she claimed permanent residence in my bedroom. Her territorial conquest had created legal obligations she had never considered. The room she had taken would soon become the most expensive bedroom she had ever occupied. The weekend passed in deceptive calm. Sarah settled into her new space with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved a long-sought goal. Mark departed with the confidence of someone who had successfully completed a difficult family intervention. They celebrated their success over Sunday dinner, toasting the completion of what they called a beneficial transition. Their self-congratulation was thorough and premature. The real consequences of their actions were scheduled to begin Monday morning. The house felt different that night, charged with anticipation that only I understood. Sarah slept soundly in her conquered territory while I prepared for the systematic reversal of her presumptions. Her victory would prove temporary, expensive, and educational. The legal documents were prepared and ready for delivery on Monday morning. Sarah's weekend of triumph would become the foundation for consequences she had never imagined. Her presumption of free residence was about to encounter market-rate reality. I waited until she left for work before beginning the transformation of our relationship from family arrangement to business transaction. The lease agreement, security deposit requirements, and tenant responsibility documentation were comprehensive and legally binding. The formal notice of tenancy establishment was delivered by certified mail to her workplace, ensuring professional receipt and preventing casual dismissal. Her assumption of residential rights would become residential obligations, complete with monthly payment requirements and standard tenant responsibilities. The documentation included photographic evidence of her territorial occupation, recorded statements about permanent residence intentions, and witness testimony regarding her gradual takeover of my bedroom. Her own words and actions provided perfect legal foundation for the tenancy establishment. Mark received copies of all documents as a secondary party to their coordination, making him aware that their family conspiracy had created unexpected legal complications. His participation in planning my displacement would now require managing Sarah's financial obligations as an established tenant. The lease terms were generous but firm. Market-rate pricing for a private bedroom with bathroom access, standard security deposit requirements, and clear expectations regarding noise, guests, and common area usage. Sarah's casual occupation would become expensive monthly reality. The eviction timeline was clearly outlined, providing her with legal minimum notice periods while establishing consequences for non-compliance with reasonable rental terms. Her choice would be simple: accept formal tenancy or face legal removal procedures. I spent Monday afternoon researching additional properties for comparison, gathering evidence to support the rental pricing in case Sarah challenged the market rate assessment. Her legal options would be limited and expensive, requiring attorney consultation she couldn't afford. The property management company confirmed their willingness to handle the rental arrangement if Sarah preferred professional management to direct family negotiations. Their involvement would add administrative fees to her monthly obligations while removing personal relationship complications from business transactions. Tuesday morning brought Sarah's response. She called from work, her voice carrying confusion, anger, and disbelief. Her assumption of free permanent residence had collided with legal reality, creating cognitive dissonance that would require time and money to resolve. Her threats of legal action were met with calm references to tenant rights documentation and property law precedents. The thoroughness of her bedroom occupation had created irrefutable evidence of established residence, making her position legally complex and financially disadvantageous. Mark's subsequent call revealed their growing understanding of the situation's implications. Their conspiracy to displace me from my own bedroom had instead created expensive monthly obligations and formal tenant-landlord relationships. Their victory had become their liability. The trap was perfect because it used their own presumptions against them. Sarah's territorial conquest became the legal foundation for her rental obligations. Her assumption of permanent residence became expensive monthly reality she couldn't escape without formal eviction proceedings. The legal framework was unforgiving and comprehensive. Sarah's months of gradual occupation had established tenancy rights that came with tenant responsibilities she had never anticipated. Her casual takeover had created formal obligations that would persist until properly terminated. The irony was educational and complete. Sarah had systematically planned to displace me from my own bedroom, only to discover that her successful occupation had trapped her in expensive monthly rental obligations she couldn't afford or easily escape. Sarah's attempts to negotiate began immediately, but from a position of legal weakness she was still struggling to understand. Her casual occupation of my bedroom had created tenant rights that came with tenant obligations, transforming her territorial conquest into expensive monthly liability. She offered to return to the guest room, but the legal precedent was already established. Her months of permanent residence had created formal tenancy that couldn't be dissolved through simple furniture relocation. The bedroom was legally hers, complete with market-rate pricing and standard tenant responsibilities. Mark attempted to mediate, suggesting family solutions that ignored legal realities. Their coordination in planning my displacement had created documentation establishing Sarah's residence intentions. Their own thoroughness had eliminated simple resolution options. The security deposit requirement particularly frustrated Sarah, who hadn't anticipated upfront costs for space she had assumed was permanently free. The amount reflected standard local practices for comparable bedroom rentals, making her occupation suddenly expensive and immediately demanding. Her work colleagues began offering legal advice that consistently confirmed her disadvantageous position. Established tenancy created rights and obligations that couldn't be casually dismissed, especially when documentation supported intentional permanent residence rather than temporary family visit. The property management company's involvement added professional complications Sarah hadn't expected. Their standard procedures included credit checks, rental history verification, and formal lease agreement requirements that transformed her casual occupation into complex business relationship. Sarah's financial situation couldn't easily accommodate market-rate rental payments. Her divorce had limited her resources, making the monthly bedroom cost a significant budget impact she hadn't planned for. Her territorial conquest had become financial burden rather than residential benefit. The legal consultation she sought confirmed her limited options and expensive potential consequences. Fighting the tenancy establishment would require attorney fees that exceeded short-term rental costs, while eviction procedures would damage her credit rating and rental history for future housing searches. Her anger gradually transformed into reluctant acceptance as the reality of her situation became clear. The bedroom she had claimed through manipulation and presumption would cost her significantly more than alternative rental arrangements she could have pursued legitimately. The irony was profound and educational. Sarah's systematic displacement of me from my own bedroom had resulted in her being trapped in expensive monthly obligations for space she could no longer afford. Her victory had become her prison. Mark's financial analysis revealed the full scope of their miscalculation. The cost of Sarah's bedroom rental would exceed quality apartment rents in nearby areas, making her conquest financially irrational and strategically counterproductive. But the legal documentation was comprehensive and binding. Sarah's own words and actions had established tenancy she couldn't escape without formal procedures that would cost more than compliance. Her presumption had created permanent disadvantage disguised as temporary victory. Her defeat was complete but quiet, administrative rather than dramatic, legal rather than emotional. The consequences matched the methodical nature of her original betrayal, providing education rather than revenge, justice rather than punishment. The rental market research I had conducted revealed that Sarah's monthly obligations exceeded comparable accommodations throughout the area. Her presumption had trapped her in the most expensive housing arrangement she could have chosen, with the least flexibility for future changes. The lease agreement included standard provisions for annual rate adjustments, ensuring that Sarah's financial obligations would increase over time rather than stabilize. Her long-term housing costs would become progressively less sustainable, eventually requiring relocation she couldn't afford to delay. The professional property management option remained available, adding administrative fees to her monthly costs, while removing personal relationship complications from our business transactions. Sarah's choices were all expensive, all legally binding, all consequences of her own presumptuous actions. Spring arrived early that year, filling my house with light that seemed to reach corners that had been dark for months. Sarah's rental payments arrived punctually, transforming her territorial conquest into steady monthly income that funded improvements she couldn't prevent or control. The dynamic between us had been permanently altered by legal reality. Her casual presumption had been replaced by formal tenant obligations that required respectful interaction and advance notice for any changes to living arrangements. The balance of power had shifted decisively and irreversibly. She adapted to her new circumstances with the resilience people develop when alternatives are worse than acceptance. The bedroom that had seemed like such a prize now felt like expensive accommodation she couldn't afford to leave. Her victory had become her burden. Mark's visits decreased significantly after he realized that their family conspiracy had backfired so completely. His appetite for coordinating territorial conquest diminished when the results included ongoing financial obligations rather than successful displacement of their father. The property management company's involvement had standardized our relationship, removing personal complications from business transactions. Sarah's rent was collected professionally, her tenant obligations were monitored systematically, and her compliance was documented thoroughly for future reference. My daily routine expanded back into spaces that had been gradually claimed during her occupation. The house felt like mine again, though now with the additional satisfaction of generating rental income from someone who had tried to claim ownership through manipulation rather than contribution. The guest room where Sarah had intended to relocate me became my home office. The irony was daily and satisfying. I worked in the space designed for my displacement, while she paid premium rates for bedroom access she had assumed would be free. Friends and neighbors who learned about the situation expressed admiration for the solution's elegant justice. Sarah's presumption had been addressed through legal channels that transformed her betrayal into my benefit, providing consequences that were educational rather than vindictive. The rental income funded home improvements that increased property value while making Sarah's tenancy more expensive to maintain. Her monthly payments contributed to renovations that priced her out of comparable local accommodations, creating financial pressure that encouraged eventual relocation. Summer brought new possibilities. The additional income from Sarah's rental payments allowed me to consider travel plans that had been postponed for years. Her betrayal had inadvertently funded the freedom she had tried to eliminate through territorial conquest. The lease agreement included annual rate adjustments tied to local market conditions. Sarah's long-term financial planning now required budgeting for increasing rental costs that would eventually exceed her capacity to maintain residence in the bedroom she had claimed through manipulation. Her situation provided daily reminders that presumption carries consequences, that family relationships don't exempt people from respecting boundaries, and that careful planning can transform betrayal into opportunity. The lessons were ongoing and comprehensive. As autumn approached, I reflected on the year's transformation. The bedroom Sarah had claimed through calculated manipulation had become her financial obligation and my steady income. Her presumption had been converted into her liability, providing justice that was both legal and poetic. The house felt peaceful again, though now with the additional security of documented boundaries and professional relationship management. Sarah's betrayal had ultimately strengthened my position, while weakened hers, creating outcomes that served justice better than revenge ever could have achieved. The garden outside what was now Sarah's rented bedroom showed the cycle of seasons continuing unchanged. Plants died back and returned, following natural rhythms that couldn't be manipulated or presumed upon. The metaphor felt appropriate and satisfying. My bedroom, when I visited it occasionally for maintenance purposes, looked different under Sarah's occupation, but not better. Her attempts to improve the space had only highlighted how perfectly it had suited my needs during the decades I had enjoyed it freely. The legal framework I had established would persist long after Sarah's eventual departure. Future family members would understand that my home operated under clear boundaries, with documented consequences for presumptuous behavior. The precedent was educational and permanent.